the difference between the directive and the regulation. The directive gives some general guidelines to the countries, telling them what the end goal of the legislation should be, so each country can implement it slightly differently, while the regulation is directly transposed to the national legislations, so it's the same, exactly the same in all of the countries. So that made it easier now. So what are the steps that you have to take to start selling your products in the EU? Firstly, you have to classify them to see if your products even are cosmetics. Sometimes you would think, yeah, this is, very obvious, but sometimes it is not. Also, maybe things that are considered cosmetics in one country are not considered cosmetics in the other. Then you have to appoint a responsible person, compile the product information file, do the CPMP notification, and finally enter the EU market and you can start selling. So we're going to go through all of these steps one by one, and you're going to see about what each of them means. Firstly, you have to classify your products. So which products are cosmetics in the EU? The regulation provides a definition that says that cosmetic product means any substance or mixture intended to be placed in contact with the external parts of the human body, or with the teeth and the mucous membranes of the oral cavity, with a view exclusively on mainly to cleaning them, perfuming them, changing their appearance, protecting them, keeping them in good condition, or correcting body odors. So there are three important things to keep in mind here. Firstly, that the products have to be placed in parts, in touch with the external parts of the human body. So anything that can be ingested, inhaled, eaten, anything that goes inside of the body is not a cosmetic. Then secondly, apart from if it goes into the mouth, so toothpastes and so on, and the function has to be exclusively or mainly to clean, to perfume, change appearance, protect, keep in good condition, or correcting body odors. And one more important thing is that it must be a substance or a mixture, so it shouldn't be a thing. It should be a machine, a device, like a comb or something like this. It has to be like a cream or a liquid. So you have to keep in this definition in mind. And then you also have to make sure that the product formula doesn't contain certain prohibited substances, or that restricted substances are within the limits proposed by the regulation. This can be found in annexes 2 to 6. Then the thing that's kind of connected with the definition of the cosmetic products is cosmetic product claims. So what you say that the product does, it has to be in line with the definition. So the function needs to be to clean, to perfume, and so on. And there are certain claims that are prohibited and can't be placed on cosmetic products. But we're going to be dealing with claims more in details later on when we're going to be talking about labeling. Now, even if sometimes if you know what the product is, what you claim for it, what the formula is like, you may still not be sure whether the product is a cosmetic or a biocide or a medical device or a pharmaceutical. These are the so-called borderline products. There are quite a few EU guidelines dealing with the borderline products. And if you're really not sure, then you can also contact one of the EU competent authorities and they can help you do the proper classification. Here then I just wrote all of the cosmetic product categories that are mentioned in the EU cosmetics regulation. There are 3 slides of them, so there are quite a few, but this is just to give you an idea what kind of products are actually considered to be cosmetics in the EU. So I'm not going to read them out loud. You can just check them by yourselves. To see a hair dryer, for example, even though its function basically or its purpose is to change appearance and so on, but it is not a substance or a mixture, therefore it's not a cosmetic product. Similarly, a toothbrush. Okay, this is about the classification of your products. Then when you know that your product is classified as a cosmetic in the EU, you can go on to the second step and appoint a responsible person. Now, who is a responsible person and why do you need one? Again, we are always going to check firstly what the regulation says. And it says here that only cosmetic products for which a legal or a natural person is designated within the community as a responsible person shall be placed on the market. Meaning the responsible person can be any natural or legal person. It can be an individual or it can be a company, but it has to be based within the EU. So you, since you're based outside of the EU, you can't act as the responsible person yourselves. Without a responsible person, cosmetic products can be placed on the EU market, and there should be only one responsible person per product for the whole of the EU. So even if you're selling, let's say in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Spain, you can't have one responsible person for each of these countries. There has to be just one responsible person that's then covering the whole EU. Now, who can act as the responsible person? We said that they have to be EU-based, so it can be a product manufacturer if the manufacturer comes from the EU. It can be the importer, it can be a distributor, or it can be a third person or a company designated as the responsible person who has to accept then this role in writing. So since you are non-EU-based manufacturers, you can't act as the responsible persons yourselves. Therefore, you have to either designate the importer of your products in the EU or a distributor or any third person or a company to be the responsible person, such as, for example, our company as well. We're offering this service. The responsibilities of the responsible person are that for each cosmetic product placed on the market, the responsible person has to ensure compliance with the relevant obligations set out in the regulation. And there are quite a few, as you can see here. But we're not going to go through all of these articles individually because there are too many. We're just going to point out what are the most important functions of the responsible person. The first one, and the one that from everything else stems out of this one, is that the responsible person has to ensure that the product is safe and compliant with the regulation. If that's the case, then basically the responsible person's job is done and they don't have anything to do from there on. However, if the product is found out that it represents a risk to human health, the responsible person needs to inform the competent authorities about it. And if necessary, take any appropriate measures to bring the product into conformity, meaning that they have to organize the product is maybe recalled from the market if it's found to be unsafe, that the product is reformulated if, for example, one ingredient that was maybe allowed when the product entered the market, but it became banned later on. So it's the responsible person's task to make sure that this product becomes in conformity with the regulation again. The responsible person has to cooperate with the EU competent authorities as well. Each country, each of the 27 countries has their own competent authority, and usually these are the local ministries of health. And in the event of any serious undesirable effects, the responsible person has to notify the competent authority of the member state where that serious undesirable effect related with the product occurred. There are also some responsibilities to do with the product information file. So the responsible person needs to keep the product information files for the products that are placed on the EU market, which they're responsible person for, at the address indicated on the label, readily accessible in electronic or other format, and available in a language which can be easily understood by local competent authority. So in most of the countries, the acceptable language that can be easily understood by the competent authorities is the local language plus English. But I'm not 100% sure that that's the case really for all of the countries, like for France or Spain or Italy. I know, for example, that in Poland, if you have the responsible person based there, you need to have the safety assessment done in Polish. They don't accept it in English. While most of the other countries, if not all, accept their local language plus English. And the responsible person needs to ensure that the product information file is kept updated at all times. So if anything changes, if the formula changes, if the labeling changes, if packaging changes, whatever changes, that has to be reflected then in the product information file, and the responsible person needs to ensure that that's kept updated. The responsible person is also the one that does the CNPN notification. And with the notification, you have to know that if your products contain nanomaterials, Especially there are three, I believe, nanomaterials that have been already been declared as safe in the EU. So titanium dioxide, carbon black, and I think it's zinc oxide that have been already declared as safe. For those, this is not necessary, but if you have any other nanomaterials in the product, the notification has to be done. You have to provide also some additional data about nanomaterial in the product. And then you have to wait for 6 months before you can actually start selling it. And within those 6 months, you give the authorities enough time to decide and to determine whether this nanomaterial is safe and can be used or not. So this is about the responsible person. Now this is the third step, and here is where we're going to spend the most amount of time, and this is also what takes the most amount of time and the most money, of course, to put together and to do, so which is the product information file. The regulation says that when a cosmetic product is placed on the market, the responsible person shall keep a product information file for it. And the product information file shall be kept for a period of 10 years following the date on which the last batch of the product was placed on the market. So what is included in the product information file? It has to contain the following information and data. First, the description of the product, the description of the method of manufacturing, and a statement on GMP compliance. Any data on animal testing. This is still written in the regulation, even though animal testing is already banned, but it wasn't banned when the regulation was written. So that's why this still remains there, but basically you shouldn't have any data there available. Then the biggest part of the PIF, which is the cosmetic product safety report, labeling and a photograph of the corresponding packaging, and the proof of the effect claimed if you have any special claims written on the product. So you can see it's quite a big chunk of paper or of documents, and now we're going to go here through each of these as well. Now here on the left side, you can also see where we are currently in this PIF so that you don't get lost. Firstly, we're going to describe this description of the product. Why is the description needed? This is needed to enable the product information file to be clearly attributed to a cosmetic product, so that you know for certain that when you have this stack of documents, the product information file, exactly which product it corresponds to. Normally, this is simply done by correlating the product names, but you can have, let's say, multiple versions of one product that have the same name but has a different and updated formula or something. So normally just the product name isn't sufficient. So that's why you can also add the code name, the ID, the product or a formula number, anything that would clearly correlate between the product when you see it, let's say on the shelf, and the product information file, that you can say, okay, these two go together. Then the method of manufacturing. Plainly speaking, or simply put, the method of manufacturing means that you need to have like a chart or a description that describes the whole process from when the raw materials get into the factory and then everything that happens to the product until it actually leaves the factory. Then I put here two quotes. The first one is from the Irish Competent Authority, which says that the method of manufacturing should include the formulation for the product and detailed manufacturing operations for each stage, such as details of equipment used, addition of raw materials, mixing speed and time requirements, details of any critical parameters, in-process controls, details on any specific temperature or humidity requirements, packaging instructions, labeling requirements, etc. So you can see this one is quite demanding, although in practice, honestly, we never receive such detailed method of manufacturing charts. We receive more something like this, what Cosmetics Europe said. They said that method of manufacturing is a brief overview of the method of manufacturing, including bulk storage and filling, and should be generally applicable to the manufacturing sites concerned. This is basically a summary of the process, cross-referenced to some more specific or more detailed documents, which can be then found at the manufacturing site or at the producer. GMP. So the regulation says that compliance with good manufacturing practice shall be presumed where the manufacturer is in accordance with the relevant harmonized standards, the references of which have been published in the official journal of the European Union. So which are these relevant harmonized standards? In the EU, this is ISO 22716. This is the GMP standard that's applicable here, or something equivalent or something even above this standard. And what's important here to know that the regulation does not require a certification to be obtained, only compliance is expected. Meaning that you don't need to have actually the ISO 22716 certificate for your plant for the manufacturing facility. But if you're producing according to this standard anyway, then you can also issue a declaration and that's considered to be sufficient. Of course, it's always better to have the actual certificate, but for the moment at least, also getting a declaration is sufficient. CPSR, by far the biggest part of the product information file, again consists of two parts. Part A, safety information, and Part B, safety assessment. Now, safety information consists of the quantitative and qualitative composition of the product, meaning basically the cosmetic product formula, the physical and chemical characteristics of raw materials in the finished product, the stability of the product, microbiological specifications of raw materials and the finished product, the challenge test, impurities, traces, and information about the packaging material, including its stability, then the normal and reasonably foreseeable use of the product, exposure to the product, the substances, toxicological profile of substances, any serious or undesirable, serious undesirable effects, and any other relevant information that you may have. So any existing data on human volunteers and so on. And again, we're going to go through each one of these one by one so that you know what exactly they mean. First one is the qualitative and quantitative composition. So basically the product formula. Here it's important to point out that the complete product composition has to be specified. Quite often we get formulas. Firstly, we get the formula from the client and we say, okay, fine, can you also provide the raw material specifications? And then we find out that quite a few of the ingredients have been left out. That, for example, if there are mixtures of, if a raw material is a mixture of various ingredients, that only the most important one has been written. But for example, any preservatives such as phenoxyethanol and so on have been just left out. And that's not okay. You know, you have to provide the whole composition, including preservatives, including antioxidants, chelators, buffering agents, solvents, other additives, etc. Excuse me. Exact percentages should be used if possible. Also, ranges are acceptable if you don't want to provide the exact concentrations, while for certain ingredients, maybe an exact concentration would have to be provided, especially if these are some restricted substances, or for perfumes, for those exact percentages are needed. For some other ingredients, maybe just ranges are sufficient. What has to be in the formula are the INCI names, the CAS numbers, INEX numbers, and functions of the ingredients. While for perfumes and aromatic compositions, also an indication of the trade name, code number, and supplier name is mandatory. For the other raw materials, trade names, the suppliers are not needed, while for perfumes and aromatic compositions, those do have to be provided in the formula. This is the sample of what we are using as a template for the formula. So you can see we usually send this then to clients for them to fill it in. Here is the INCI names, which I said is mandatory. The trade name, which isn't actually mandatory, but it's mandatory just for perfumes. But we ask normally the clients to provide it anyway because it makes it way easier than to check the raw material specifications. The manufacturer or supplier of the raw material or the ingredient. Then here the functions are written of the ingredients, percentage weight breakdown. This is used for raw materials that are actually mixtures of various ingredients. Then the concentration in finished product and CAS and INEX numbers. So you see everything that you mentioned that has to be there is included in this template that we are using. Secondly, the physical and chemical characteristics of raw materials and the finished product. Here we can't really say what are the things that are necessary, because what's relevant for the physical and chemical characteristics really depends on what the raw material or the finished product is like. The requirements are quite different for, let's say, perfumes or for, I don't know, shampoos. Different things are relevant. But here are just some examples what can be provided. This is especially written for raw materials. Chemical identification, physical form, molecular weight, solubility, partition coefficient, substance purity, average molecular weight, so on. So for raw materials, here you don't have to actually worry about this if you're the producers, because this kind of information can be found in the raw material safety data sheets and certificates of analysis or technical data sheets. This is also what we require if we are compiling the product information file. We ask for each raw material that the MSDS and COA are provided, while for perfumes, then also our certificates and lists of allergens are needed. For finished products, we normally ask for a certificate of analysis. And here also you have to know that for certificates of analysis, as you know, are done when the batch is produced, and then some products are tested to see if everything's within the range. So acceptable ranges have to be provided. You can't just write, let's say pH is 5.7, but it's good to provide the range. Like pH is acceptable if it's between 5.5 and 6.5, for example. Then the stability of the cosmetic product. This is a requirement for all cosmetic products. Sometimes we get questions if a stability test is needed for products that don't contain water. And yes, it is needed. The stability test is required for all cosmetic products. It means the stability of the cosmetic product under the various conditions that it can be subjected to from the moment it's manufactured until the end of its validity. The purpose is to ensure that the new or modified product meets the intended physical, chemical, and microbiological quality, as well as functionality and aesthetics when used, stored under appropriate conditions. Basically, stability test is done to prove the shelf life of the product. So what's the expiration date? It can, or actually it should be done when you're developing new products. So at the beginning, when you develop new products, you have to determine whether it's stable, what the shelf life of the product would be. So you have to do it at that time. And if nothing then changes, if you are keeping the formula the same, the method of manufacturing the same, the raw materials the same, then you don't have to do it ever again. However, if you have to redo the stability test, if there are significant changes in the manufacturing process, if you, for example, purchase some new equipment for your factory, and then you have to do the stability test again, if any significant changes occur in the raw materials being used, of course, if the formula changes, that goes without saying, and also when significant changes occur in the packaging material that comes in contact with the product. If that changes, then you have to redo the stability test, because with stability, we normally do compatibility as well. And we're going to discuss that a bit later. So how do you perform it? There is this ISO standard, but it's kind of useless. It's very generic. So to be a bit more specific, there are two basic ways of doing the stability test. The first one is the real-time stability test, and the second one is accelerated stability test. Real-time stability test means that if you want to claim a shelf life of, let's say, 3 years, you get a sample, you put it somewhere on room temperature in conditions that would otherwise be stored in, and you keep it there for 3 years, and every couple of months you do some tests, you see if the physical, chemical, or microbiological specifications are still within the predefined limits. The second one is an accelerated stability test, which is what most companies do. And it usually takes 3 months. We do it, it's not really described how it should be performed. There are various ways of doing it, but how we do it is that we put the product on 40 degrees Celsius on room temperature and in a fridge, so on 5 degrees Celsius. We also drew a freeze-thaw test, meaning that we freeze the product, then put it on high temperature, freeze it, put it on high temperature, do that cycle a couple of times. It performed it in inert in a glass container and in the packaging in which the product is going to be placed on the market. And we also test for UV exposure, meaning that we put the sample on some shelf where the sun is shining, and so that we see if also UV then determines the stability of the product, if it affects the stability. What to monitor? Just, it depends on the product. Whatever is relevant for that product do include some physical and chemical specifications as well as microbiology. Sometimes we get stability tests for creams that contain, 80% water, and then everything that has been tested is how it looks and how it smells. And this isn't really sufficient. For this kind of product, that would be sufficient for, let's say, lipsticks. How it looks and how it smells, fine. But for creams, for shampoos, for anything that contains water, you have to include some chemical specifications and microbiology as well. Check also the pH, viscosity, microbiology, these kind of things. So we have also our own laboratory, and I'm just going to show you, hopefully it's going to work, an example of how we do the stability test. It usually takes a while for it to open. Okay, here it is. So this is an example of our template for the stability and compatibility test. Here we have which samples have been tested. Then here we do in glass container on 40 degrees and 5 degrees, what has been tested after 2 weeks, 6, 10, 12. What were the results? Then the results in the original packaging. Here we put the photo of the product so that it's, again, clearly attributed to which product this belongs to. A photo of how the product looked at the beginning and at the end. Then the freeze-thaw test, as I said, we put the product on -15 degrees and then on 25 degrees, and we do 3 cycles like this to see what happens with the product. This also then mimics maybe the transportation. If you're sending the product somewhere by plane, it can go to -15, and then we see that this doesn't, let's say, break the packaging or affect the product somehow in a negative way. And also microbiology at the beginning, at the end. And of course, what also quite often, surprisingly, is missing in the stability tests that we receive from some other companies is the conclusion. So is the product safe or not? And storage stable or not? And what's the then recommended shelf life? Okay. Then microbiological specifications of raw materials in the finished product. For raw materials, this is relevant for those that are susceptible to microbial growth, especially water-based mixtures, protein-rich materials, plant or animal-derived raw materials. And again, here, you have to depend on your raw material suppliers. If they think that this is relevant, that they're going to put this in the certificate of analysis of the raw material. In a finished product, on the other hand, you as the producers are responsible for this, and you have to do the commonly investigated microbial specs, which is the total bacterial count, total mold and yeast count, aerobic total count, or something like this. Plus, what is quite often missing are these 4 pathogens. Just doing the total